Hello, Leah Renee. Thank you for coming back on the Faucet. If you're only listening to this, this is the first time I'm endeavoring to record the video as well. So maybe you're watching it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Thank you for being here, Leah.
Thank you for having me.
So this is the second in a series of you asking questions and me answering them, and also us having a conversation because we are friends and colleagues in comedy and life. The the topic that we'll start with is you said hard to know where to start. Maybe because you're right at the border of taping your special, we can chat about how do you determine when you're ready to film it, what do you do to prepare, what material you choose to include and why. Do you stick to your script or allow some playtime / freedom in your show in case lightning in a bottle happens? And then additionally, you had asked previously, where's the line between a special should be special and done is better than perfect, especially knowing that your material will continue to improve after your special? How do you know when it's cooked and ready to serve while knowing you'll still continue to improve it? Do you run it by others before deciding to submit it or film it? If so, who and how? How do all those questions sound? Do you have any updates or edits or thoughts before we dive in?
No, I think those sound great, and it's nice timing with yours only, a few weeks away.
Yes, as we record this, about a month from my New York City filming of the show that you saw in Edinburgh in 2023 that will be called Before We Get Started. So now, that has all been before we get started. And now, as we get started, um, let me get back to the beginning. So, how do you determine when you're ready to film it? I think this will have broader implications for just how do you know when you're ready for anything. For me, I'll speak from my own experience. I know when I'm ready for something sometime after I was ready for it. And I think that that's better, especially when filming a special. I mean, here's the thing. I think we might get into questions about different comedians and their specials and their styles. Like Rory Scovel recorded a special / documentary called Live Without Fear, where he did 6 hours of improvised comedy. And the resulting special is not 6 hours, but it is, I think it's like an hour and a half, and includes a lot of interviews and then also just a lot of the comedy that he came up with on the spot. And that is a beautiful thing. That is one way to do a special, to do it before you have any information, any material. If you're Rory, or if you're Rory-like, which I definitely aspire and strive to be at times. I think of him frequently, and he was inspirational when I first saw him in 2006. Because he wasn't just doing his written material, he was really bringing the in-between moments to life and creating and experimenting and riffing and just really making beautiful things. And so I love doing that, like the jazz improvisation of comedy compared to the orchestral symphony curation of, what most people are doing, and certainly what I'm doing most of the time when I'm getting ready to record a special or an album. So I will say that this will be my second hour special that I have filmed. The first being Small, Dark, and Handsome, which I filmed in 2013 and came out in 2014. And that one, actually, I think I had the opportunity to film it, and I could have spent more time preparing that material, but because I had just recorded an album, Meet Robot, less than a year earlier. But I was like, I have an hour, and I'm excited about it, and I'm ready to go with it. And then there were a lot of moments in that filming that were like things I'd never said before because they occurred to me in the moment, the lightning in various bottles.
So I'm curious because you've got some video specials and audio specials.
Mhm.
You have what, 5 or 6 albums, right? Is that
Yes,
audio?
I would say so. Available to anyone right now as we record this, there you could listen to my albums Vegan Mind Meld, Meat Robot, No Kidding, uh, AKA, and live in between albums, which is the first of 3 live in between albums I've recorded. So there are 2 that are only playing exclusively on Sirius satellite radio right now. Live in between albums 2, Rocky Mountain High, and live in between albums 3, Longer, Louder, Weirder. Uh, but of the ones that are available, and then Small Dork and Handsome, the special from 10 years ago, is also available as an album. If you've only seen it, there's actually a track that only exists in audio. But yeah, so I have
I guess
since two.
I'm
Yeah.
curious how you pick. Sorry for
Oh
interrupting. I
no,
just
please.
wanted to make sure I didn't forget.
Yes.
Um, so you've done a lot more audio recordings than video recordings, and my assumption is that that's just because of cost. And it's easier to record audio than do video. And now there's obviously a lot more emphasis on video and clipping things up and putting up reels and things like that. So maybe, and I don't know, this would be an additional question to preparing specials. Would you still recommend that comedians record audio albums so that they have something to submit to Sirius? But then does that conflict if you want to do a video one, but you've already released an audio, if there's overlap and, oh, I've already heard this. So like, where does that, because I think you started before video was the big medium that everybody wanted to have. So is audio dying? Does it compete with your video? Does it, do you run into problems with content overlapping? So maybe Sirius is less likely to want something if you also have it in a video special, or vice versa. If you're trying to sell your video special somewhere and they're like, oh, all the audio is already on these albums. So how does that go into your strategy of what material you include versus leave
These
out?
are great questions. And there's a lot to unpack, and I'll do my best to do it all. So I hope that the audio industry continues to thrive. I do think that satellite radio, Sirius in particular, which is where a lot of my albums are, continues to thrive and be a place. Like, there's many people who have discovered my comedy because they were driving in their car and it just came on, and then I'm sure there's numerous people who've heard me for the first time that way, and then didn't let me know that happened, but may have become fans or joined my mailing list or followed me on social media if they heard my name and remembered it. And then there's definitely people who did hear me on there and wrote to me and was like, hey, where can I get this track? Or I loved this joke. And it was so in 2017, I think, is the first time that I was in between. I felt like I was in between like big shows, like shows that were about something. Like the album No Kidding was mainly created surrounding my not wanting children, and that being like sort of the central theme of that album. And then so that was recorded in 2016, and then an album in 2019 I recorded, AKA, which was originally entitled All Killing Aside. And the themes of that one were about like love and compassion and not murdering. And so then I also found that just I still wrote jokes that were not sort of aligned with either of those themes, but I loved the jokes. And so in 2017, I just recorded an hour that I called Live in Between Albums. And I explicitly thought about it being, most of the jokes ended up being pretty clean. And I know that on Sirius Radio, there's at least one clean comedy channel that, because there's a smaller amount of clean comedy than there is comedy, just subset wise. I was optimistic that it could get, if we gave that to them exclusively. So to answer your question, I do believe that when comedy, when like Sirius has an album of mine and they're the only ones that have it, I think that hopefully encourages them to play it more. So that was thankfully, it seemed to be true that from when we gave it to them, that album in 2018, and we gave it to them exclusively, we being me and Blonde Medicine, my production partners, the people who have produced my last several albums, uh, they they were like, yeah, this seems like a good idea. And from 2018 until for several years, it played a lot, and we're like, let's just keep it rolling as long as they're playing it as extensively as they are. And usually, after some amount of time, or if you give them another album, as we gave them, AKA in 2020, they won't just keep playing. If I gave them 8 albums, they won't play all of the albums as much. They might play more than if I just gave them 1 album or 2 or 3 or 4. But there's a lot of comedians out there, and I'm happy for them to get play as well. But so when the wave of live in between albums one started receding, that's when we decided to release it, more widely. So that's why it is available on Spotify and Apple Music and all the places you can get albums for quote unquote free. And so definitely now let's zoom back. I remember when I had my first hour of comedy, which became Vegan Mind Meld, then I remember I was trying to write as many jokes as I could so that people wouldn't be like, "Hey, I already saw this," which I feel like I got my first taste of, because my half-hour Comedy Central special was basically it came out in 2010, the same year that Vegan Mind Meld came out, and I think all of the jokes in in that half-hour special were from, it was basically half of the album. And so if you saw the special and then listened to the album, like there were some people that I remember comments on the album, like on Amazon, people are like, "Hey, like I already knew half of these." And I'm like, "Hooray, I have a fan." Like people
Remember.
just,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and cut back now to this day and age where social media reels are, a big way that people might discover you. A friend of mine, Alex Hooper, a very funny comedian, I think it was in his newsletter that I'm on his mailing list, and he shared something that a friend of his had shared, that who does very well on social media, and that friend every like 3 months will release the same reels, because in this day and age, it's not just that your fans see it. It's that, new people who've never heard of you are just shown it by the algorithm. So even if 1 million people saw it 3 months ago, hopefully a different 1 million people could be shown it this month or in 3 months. And so in some ways, this is all to say, not that I have stopped caring about, like, I still have the original idea in my mind of like, I want to put out an album and then I want to be done with that material because I'm on to the next material. And so if you listen to you can listen to most of my albums and be like, all of these are different, 8 different hours of comedy. Now there's a slight exception that every once in a while there's like a joke that I go into other material with, like a joke about veganism might start the same way on two, like have like the one punchline the same on 2 different albums, or a joke about my girlfriend that goes in different directions but starts the same way. And I have not resigned myself. I'm content with the idea that if you're a Myq Kaplan completist, you might eventually hear the same joke twice in a sea of, in an ocean of
Snakes. No, just kidding.
different jokes. Yeah. You might find like one wave that looks similar to another wave. And then also I did in 2021, I think, I forget if that's when I recorded it or when it came out. I think maybe I recorded my Dry Bar special in 2021 and then it came out in 2022. And the Dry Bar special I did entirely to be, I conceived of it as a greatest, cleanest hits, where Renee, my beloved partner, and I listened back to, at the time, the 5 albums that I had released and thought, what of these jokes could be a wonderful introduction to, new people who will see me on the Dry Bar app and will fit the parameters. Like, I didn't write specifically clean jokes for it, but I was like, of the 5 hours I'd created, there was about an hour that seemed like it would be perfect, and they only needed a half hour. So I think part of what I'm thinking now is like, I definitely want to create more and more material for my fans, the people who know me, the people who have seen everything that I've done. Uh, and I will continue to create hours of comedy as long as I can. And then also now I'm thinking about, oh, like, who can I reach? Like, most of the reels that I've been sharing for the past few weeks or months are from, jokes that I wrote and recorded years ago, as opposed to, I know a lot of people are, I am filming things now, but I guess I still have the idea that I might not want to share a joke for the first time as a reel if I have
Hmm.
an idea that I want to share it as a larger piece of comedy. So for the hour I'm recording in a month, before we get started, I think I have not shared any of the hour online, and once it exists as, something that can be streamed or downloaded or what have you, then I will also take clips from it and share it to people with the hope that it will, garner new fans, direct people to the entire special. Uh, because I mean, yeah, we live in a time now where it does seem like, I mean, some people are using reels and social media clips as like advertisements for their live shows or their tour, which makes a lot of sense, or to, to garner fans, to direct them to their albums or hours of comedy. uh, so the question of what I'm doing as compared to like what I would recommend somebody like newer doing, I think is, I mean, also it's changing so quickly
Yeah.
that, the advice that I might have had, when I was starting, or that I might have received when I was starting, that might have been good advice. Like, I mean, the shortest answer is I don't know. Um, but
It
I,
seems like the method now is that a comedian will work on either a half an hour or an hour, and they'll build that out over the space of maybe 2 years. Then they will film it and like self publish it on YouTube, or try to get a bigger like Comedy Dynamics or 800 Pound Gorilla or somebody to get it, and then do it the first time in full with them. And then when that's released, clip that up, leak out those clips to push people to watch the full thing while they start writing their new half hour or hour, to just repeat the process again. It seems like it's kind of the new way of doing it.
yeah, I think that is 100% apt. That's it. No notes. That really seems like what a lot of people are doing. I have been fortunate in a way, that when I recorded my first, album, which was I think like 45 or 50 minutes, I recorded it in 2009. It came out in 2010. By that point, I had had a year to, work on more things so that if people saw that or listened to that album or saw my half hour on Comedy Central at that time, and then they came to see me live, I had a good chunk. I was like ahead of the game with new material, as opposed to, my understanding is, and I'm not an expert, but like Carlin was sort of the first person, who I think really developed the pattern of, he would record a special, they would film a special maybe every 2.5 years or so, so about what we're seeing today for a lot of people as well. And my understanding is that you're familiar with the concept of a Theseus's ship.
No, actually.
Okay. So there is a paradox, it is presented as, that Theseus was out to sea and he was on his ship, and there was like a plank that needed replacing. They replaced one plank. And
Oh,
so,
is
like,
this that they replaced the whole ship eventually?
yes.
Right.
So for the listener, if you're not familiar, they replaced one plank, and so is that still Theseus's ship? Of course. Who would? It's 99.9% the same ship, but then while they're out to sea, they replace over the course of some time all of the planks. So now none of the ship is the same as it was.
Well, that's how
But
our bodies are too, right? Every 7 years, like the cells that we all had die and like the new ones, blah, blah, blah.
100%.
We are, am I me from it? Was that even you in your specials from 10 years ago? That was not, that was a different ship.
Oh yes, and if you go quantum, every moment we are being replaced, by identical particles, subatomic particles. And so, I mean, that's why the Buddhist concept of non self really resonates, with quantum physics and me. I am quantum physics. You can't tell me that I'm not.
That is
And
there's your next title, and it won't be you, and it'll be perfect.
yeah, there's someone's next title for
Like, is
sure.
that your special? Well, not anymore. How long ago was it? All of those cells have been replaced.
Absolutely. Um, so this is all to say the way that the Theseus's ship paradox ends, in my understanding of it, is he eventually gets back to land, and the ship, every moment of it, you're like, it's the same ship. And then they take all of the planks that were the original ship, put them back together into the original ship. Now, which one is Theseus's ship? A thing that we cannot do with our cells, or if we could, yai.
Is that a Yiddish word for I don't want to save all my poop and figure out how to eat it? Like,
I I'll say again, I do not know, but sounds plausible. So this is all to say that is what I believe Carlin did with his act. That he didn't throw it all out. Like the day, if you saw him a week after he recorded a special, you
okay,
would probably see a lot of what was in the special, like with maybe one 5-minute chunk removed and another 5-minute chunk that he was working on inserted. And then if you saw him halfway to the next recording, you might have seen half of the old show and half of the new show, that he was replacing it plank by plank.
and it's curious because it seems like in the UK, what a lot of the comedians do is they come up with their hour and it has a name, and they tour that specific show, and they include all the same bits in it, and then they can it after a year or two, and then they have a new show. And that's the benefit of going to Fringe, because then you can run your new stuff for a month and then tour it. But I know I think it was Brian Regan didn't like to name his tours, because then if you named it something, then it's like, oh, this is the hot dogs are hilarious tour or something like that. And it's like almost like a book that has chapters and it follows this thing, and that's the show. Where it's like, no, I'm just telling jokes for an hour, I don't have to call it anything special. But then there are some comedians that feel like you write a show, you have this specific material, once you've filmed it, it's dead, and you start from scratch building it up because you've done all of that. And so you're trying to help people know, oh, I've already read War and Peace, not I'm just Tolstoy, I'm just throwing out stuff. It's like, no, this is the story, which is funny because American comedians don't tend to follow like a story arc. It's just like Michelle Wolf, like joke show. It's usually just ham-handed. This is a funny 5 minutes. This is a funny 5 minutes, just kind of shoved together. So you actually could Theseus ship your comedy pretty easily. But if you have a narrative art, like that's why I think some of I can see some of the things in the show that you did at Fringe, how you could remove certain parts of that and Frankenstein's monster them into other places. But the through lines and the journey that you take them on, to me, does feel like its very own specific thing that is more enjoyable when all consumed as this 7-course meal.
Oh yes. Another apt analysis. I will say a couple things. Number one, I probably will, once this special is recorded, not do it in its full form or much in its piecemeal possibilities after, because I have a few other hours that I've been working on that will be what I now spend my time, curating and honing and going through the process that Renee has nicknamed the blooming phase of, coming up with a lot of new things, and then the pruning phase, eventually editing it to a quote unquote final form to potentially be recorded, to the point that you raise.
Put it in the can, because once you've done, you've canned the veggies that you've grown, and
Yes.
then start anew.
Yes, and every once in a while, it is fun to go back to the can and open it like Popeye's spinach and be like, "Wow, this I'm really powerful." And this is all to say
that you're close to the finish.
Yeah, absolutely, and I don't think there is a finish. So, but I'm strong. I fight to the. I mean, I don't even fight. So he fights to the finish. I just peacefully keep going forever. That's the difference between me and Popeye. He eventually the spinach wears off, but not for me. Um, I think the difference that you describe between the UK model and the US model, again, there's probably there's a lot of exceptions. Like Myq Birbiglia, I think, is the comedian who springs to mind, who is an American comedian who does something more akin to what you've described as the UK model of creating a whole beautiful show that is has a narrative, has a through line. And then there's also many, UK comedians who don't follow or subscribe to you must have a narrative piece with emotional growth, the fringe fest one person show model. But those are useful kind of avatars or placeholders. I do think the question is very interesting as to, like, for people who go to Fringe, are they doing it as the culmination and celebration of a tour that they've worked towards, and then they might record? I know some people who will do that, like tour leading up to Fringe and then record at the end of Fringe or once it's over. And then there are people who will create their show and then perfect it at Fringe and then tour with that show. And so I mean, either way, like this is a wonderful example of whatever works for you. There is no one path. Like, all these paths lead up the same mountain of, doing what you love and creating. If you love creating an hour of comedy, there's so many ways to do it. And then the question, to get back to your question of how do I know when it's ready to record? So part of the idea was I recorded that first half-hour special in 2009, and it came out in 2010. And then I waited a while. I think I had a new hour of comedy after a year, but it wasn't, and I did it at like a theater. And I was like, I did it. I didn't need my old closer. I didn't need my old opener. Is this hour ready to be recorded? Absolutely not. So that was sort of an exercise for me. And I did still go on, as I would tour, make sure that I closed with a closer that I knew worked. And that, so I was doing kind of, the Carlin model of a little of column A, a little of column B, some of the old, some of the new, until I had enough new. And so back to the theme or the concept that I mentioned earlier, I recorded my second stand-up album, Meet Robot, in 2012, I believe. And it came out in 2013. And the month before, I think I recorded it in September. And in August, I was preparing. I was like, I think I have enough material for a new hour of comedy. And a friend of mine was doing a theater show, like had a theater in New York City that they were doing like a play every night for a couple weeks. And they were like, after we have the place all night, if you want to do a comedy show, we're doing the play at 7, you want to do a comedy show at 9.
Oh, nice.
So for 2 nights, I prepared, I like made a bunch of notes and I like presented it as, kind of like workshopping what the hour of that I would record would be. And I found on the first night, I did about an hour and a half and only got through like half of what I had intended. And I had done some riffing, some in the moment stuff. It wasn't that I had 3 hours of material, but eventually when I went to Acme in Minneapolis to record the following month, I think I did, 70 minutes on the late shows and 50 minutes on the early shows, and ended up with close to an hour and a half of material that I was happy with, which is what then led me to have that album only be about 45 minutes. And then I had at least half of the special that I would record the next year that would become Small, Dork, and Handsome. Because at the time, I was not doing the UK Myq Birbiglia narrative throughline model. I had a bunch of jokes and I loved them. And that was like my first several albums were just the funniest jokes that I have right now. Small, Dork, and Handsome was actually the first time that I at least played with the structure, where I was like, I know it's going to end with a time travel bit, so I'm going to open it this way, and there's going to be some fun things that happen in the middle. structurally, if not conceptual. I mean, conceptually maybe as well, but not like thematically. It's not, the
Mm.
show's not about time travel in full. Like there's just a lot of fun things in it with a fun framing of time travel. And then that was like a baby step towards No Kidding, which was the first time that I thought, oh, maybe I could do a whole hour at least based on a theme, if not, because the whole hour isn't all about, every joke isn't about my journey of deciding that I didn't want children, but it all sprung from that well. And this is all to say, like when I was getting ready to record that second album, I I waited longer than I needed to, and eventually realized like, oh, like I recommend. I mean, and here's the thing: the Buddha has recommended, many things that are the opposite of other things that he has recommended. Like to perhaps I shared this with you, his musician student who said like sometimes it seems like we're supposed to be very like have a strict practice, right, and be almost rigid with like these are the ways to do things, but at other times it seems like it's better to be gentle and kind with ourselves and not do that. So he says, which is it? Should we practice in a regimented way, or should we be loose and gentle with ourselves? And the Buddha says something like, when you tune your instrument, would you rather it be too tight or too loose, the strings? Would you rather the strings be too tight or too loose? And, the answer is optimally neither too tight nor too loose. So the advice is, if it's too tight, loosen. If it's too loose, tighten. And so when I say for myself, I've found, like I was about to say this piece of advice, which is better to wait too long than do it too soon. And that's advice that has served me, but the opposite might serve you, because I actually just read a thing by James Clear in his newsletter the other day that was like, some things require immediate action or like just start. Some things require like immediate planning, or maybe the immediate's not the word, but initial. Like he's like, if you want to write a book, start writing immediately. Don't get too bogged down in planning. If you want to build a building, start planning. Don't just start building, right?
I think it's
So
harder to undo some of those things. Well, I mean, it's interesting, the idea of recording audio albums, which, to be honest, I don't hear people talking about as much. It's only, I mean, I'll hear like Jackie Cation talk about how her stuff is doing on Sirius or something, but at least the comics that I'm coming up with, or that are, a level or two ahead of me, it's sort of the goal to get a Netflix special or 800-Pound Gorilla, or release it on your own on YouTube, because of what happened with Sam Morril. Like that, he just was like, nobody wants this, fine, I'll do it myself. And then it blew up. But I don't hear that many people talking about doing albums, but they seem much more forgiving, because if there's no video on it, you could presumably record it in the same space over multiple sessions and then edit it together kind of seamlessly. Um, I don't know.
absolutely.
Is that just maybe because does Sirius not pay as well? Is it more competitive? I'm not sure why more comedians don't do audio or ever consider doing an audio album. But I was told that Sirius XM receives something in the ballpark of 1,000 comedy albums per month, like people submitting them to try to get them on their station. But the clean comedy channel is about 100 submissions a month. And
Yeah, that the I don't know, I can't confirm, but that groks that like aligns with my understanding. Also, it's funny that you're like, why aren't people talking about making audio albums? And also, 1,000 people a month are doing it.
yeah,
Um, so because I think also what is happening with a lot of the people who are recording video specials is they do record the audio of those specials, and that audio does often get submitted to Sirius as well, but it's not the main focus. Though it is often the main focus for like businesses like 800-Pound Gorilla and like most comedy record companies, production companies, like there is money to be made by Sirius. Like having your album, if your album gets played a lot, you get more money per track played on Sirius than any of the streaming, by Spotify or Pandora or Amazon by a vast number, by a vast measure. So
Hmm.
absolutely. I mean,
Maybe it just seems less sexy because I don't know anybody that listens to Sirius XM in their car. That's not that they don't, but my demographic, the thing that gets attention is like views on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube and Facebook. Like that's
oh
kind of
yeah.
where the attention is. But it's interesting to think that someone could have a comedy clip that has 10 million views on Instagram, that they're getting nothing for those views other than a potential ticket sale or something. But if you have a tenth of that engagement on Sirius, it could be $2,000 a month. Or I mean, I don't know how much it pays, but it seems kind of like the less sexy secret of comedy of like if you can get it's like, I'm just like, who's listening to Sirius? I just think it's like truckers that are listening to Sirius, or people that have traveling sales jobs. But because I listen to podcasts in the car, I just listen to something on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or something. But like, what's the
Yeah.
demographic that listens to Sirius XM?
Great question. Once again, one of my heroes, the Dalai Lama. What I may have shared this with you, was asked a great question once, and he said, "That is a very good question. The answer is simple. I don't know." And I'll add,
Oh,
not that I don't care, but like there definitely are, like, Sirius is making money and they're paying comedians. And I mean, I both here's another, have I shared with you this quote by Niels Bohr I like, which kind of goes along with a thing I said recently, which is, he said the opposite of a fact is a falsehood, but the opposite of a profound truth might in fact be another profound truth. And so here are two things that might be contradictory that I believe both. Number one, I would love for every comedian to know that there is money to be made on Sirius. And I would also love for
Serious money.
no other comedians to know, because the more both, I mean, I want good things for everyone.
So edit this out.
Gianmarco Ceresi, do you know?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, he had a tweet I really liked, some like a year or two, or I don't even know, ago, and he said something like, "I think that the industry should be booking more people of color, more queer people, more people of all marginalized communities, and me." Uh, and I just think that that's hilarious and resonant to my experience. I'm like, I want Sirius to be playing every wonderful comedian out there, and make sure me too, please.
And I'm wonderful. I mean, that's one of the reasons I wanted to ask you, because I don't know how common it is amongst comedians, but there is a stereotype that you have to be a bit delusional to do comedy, to think that you have something that's interesting to say, that people will pay to hear you talk. But at the same time, if you listen to like Neil Brennan's blocks, you hear a lot of people talk about having imposter syndrome. So maybe your profound truth thing is that, like, it's true that comedians are overconfident, delusional, grandiose, blah, blah, blah. But they also are filled with self doubt and imposter syndrome. And it's like, how can you be both, sort of thing? For me, I will absolutely say that I have the opposite of imposter syndrome. I always have. I designed a whole company's website one time, and I don't know HTML. I just could aesthetically do it, and it was a company that I loved, and I said, "Hey, you could have a better website." So I designed one like in Apple Pages, like the equivalent of Microsoft Word, took a screenshot, sent it to them, and then they hired me. And then my husband, who's actually a web designer, is like, "They just hired you to make a website. You don't know how to code." I'm like, "We'll figure it out." And so I'm more likely to go, "I'm ready for a special." And people are like, "This is garbage." but it's like it's as good as I can make it right now. And so in terms of being ready, it's like from where I was 2 years ago, I feel like, oh yeah, I'm ready. But I know that in 2 years time from there, I'll be like, oh man, I stunk. And so typically am a done is better than perfect kind of person. But at the same time, I think there might be certain markers in your material that, yeah, that could be a little bit tighter. And yet I've heard lots of comedians say they will release their special and be like, I came up with 2 extra tags to that and it's such a better joke now and I can't go back. And so I wonder if sometimes that's why comedians retire material, because it's too painful to see that you could have cooked that cake a little bit longer and then it was a little doughy in the center. And if you just would have given it a few more minutes in the oven, it would have been perfect. But you were like, I didn't have the luxury of, I could just needed to move forward. Cause that's where I am right now with filming my submission tape for Dry Bar. I'm like, could my set be better? Yes. Is their ratio of male to female ridiculous? Yes. So I'll be better in 2 years and maybe I can submit another one then. But right now, I mean, I did the math. It's like 542 male comedians and 52 female comedians.
Wow.
It's a huge gap. And so am I hoping that I get it like just because I'm a woman? I mean, I think it helps, but I mean, we're, more than half the population. So I'll go for it anyways. And if they're like, we just need a token female, I'm fine with it because I know whatever I record in 2 years, I'm going to be like, Leah, that you could have done so much better. It's like, I couldn't have. This was as best as I could.
Yeah, I have many things to say. Number one, I don't know if the stereotype is true that most comedians are delusional, but the monotype for this comedian, me, is that when I started, I was delusionally self-confident and it served me well. Here's a joke that I tell sometimes, mostly on podcasts. That, I mean, and it is the truth, essentially, that a year into comedy, I looked back on the comedy that I had created before, like from my first sets. I listened back and I was like, wow, that's bad. Thank God I'm good now, a year later. And then a year later, I looked back on that and was like, wow, thank God I'm good now. That was every year I could look back and be like, thank God I'm good now, which is wonderful until eventually, years and years later, I'm like, I could use some improvement, which speaks to, there's a Zen master I like, or a Buddhist teacher named Shunryu Suzuki, goes by Suzuki Roshi sometimes. And one of my favorite quotes of his is, each of you is perfect as you are, and you can use some improvement. Like, that's true.
Yeah,
You are.
I don't know who said it. They said, I wish that I was as good at comedy as I thought I was 2 years in.
Oh, that's beautiful.
I don't know if you're the one that told me that, but that's about where I am. Because
Mhm.
I think in about 2 years, that's where at least for me, where I get to the point where I know what will work, but do I want to say that? But when you're new, it's like, is this going to work? And it doesn't. Is this going to work? And it doesn't. Is this going to work? And then it does. And you're like, haha, I can tell jokes. And then you get enough of those that you can do shows and get consistent laughs. And we've talked about this before, like a joke that I had that you kind of, it's not that you called me on it, like you were very kind about it, but it's like, you could say anything. Is that what you want to say? And I'm like, I want to say what's funny. And when you're new, you don't know what that is. And then I think about 2 years in, then you start going, what's the actual premise of that? Is that so I've gone through my set and just been like, what is this? Premise identification is very boring because you see how mundane what you're saying is. What's the premise? Cooking takes a long time. And you're like, that's all what I'm trying to say. And so it's like you start taking things a bit more seriously, which is why I wonder with specials, does that play into what you decide to film in a special, and when do you decide you're ready? Do you kind of look through it and go, yeah, these are funny and they work, but I don't know if this is what I want to say, but I don't know if what I want to say is funny enough yet, because it's trickier to do good storytelling versus just narration. And so many comedians just narrate something that funny that happened to them rather than like actual storytelling where it's a show don't tell.
Sure. Here are a couple other things, like responsive to that and what you said earlier. There's a comedian friend of mine who, at this point, I don't know if he has put out an album. I think he might have, but I remember years and years ago, he had an hour of comedy that was great, and he had not recorded it. And I asked him, "Hey, why haven't you recorded it as an album, as a special, anything?" And he said, "Well, because I know that I can do better, right? I know that in a year I'll have a better hour."
Mhm.
And I was like, "Well, then, game that out moving forward. How when if you always know and if you're confident that you're always going to be growing and you'll never record an album or an hour or a special until I thought this was I was like, so here's my suggestion: record the hour that you have now, don't release it. Record the next hour that you have and hope. And is it better? Okay, then don't release either of them. Then keep recording hours of comedy and never release them until you get to a point where you've recorded one that you're like, I actually don't know if this is better than the last one, and then release the last one that was the funniest one. It's like it reminds me of a Calvin and Hobbes uh, joke where like they're driving over a bridge and it says weight limit, I don't know, 2 tons. And Calvin's like asks his dad, how do they know what the weight limit is? And his dad says, well, they just keep driving. They build the bridge and they drive bigger and bigger trucks over until the bridge collapses. Then they weigh that last truck. And then then they rebuild the bridge and they're like, this is the weight limit of the bridge now. Uh, and I think that's hilarious and that's not the best way to.
There's that story about the ass that perishes in indecision. There's like a donkey and there's two bales of hay, and it's like, oh, that one's good, and it can't, and then it just starves to death. Like
That
I don't
is
have the luxury of starving to death because I'm the legal guardian of three additional people and the companion to someone else who's been making hay. And so I kind of am just like willing to throw things against the wall. I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm willing to put out complete garbage. It's not
I mean,
complete garbage, but it's as good as it can be right now, but it'll be better later. But hey, why not?
yeah. So
And
I
then
think that
you're less likely to ask for raises at work. And so I've also wondered if the dry bar men women gap is that a lot of women just won't, even if they are comedians, which tend to be more, confident and gutsy than the average woman in a patriarchal society like ours. But basically applying for a comedy special is similar to asking for a raise. You're being vulnerable, you're asking for something that wasn't given to you, but all you had to do was ask, and then you did get it, but you felt weird about asking. And so I guess um, some days I'm like, how come Dry Bar doesn't like solicit more women? That sounds bad, but like, because I can think of funny, clean female comics in my scene and other scenes, but I think they're kind of like, hey, if you're a female comedian that's clean, then just apply to, just come and get it. But a lot of them aren't, I guess. So I'm trying to get a mediocre special so that very good female comedians will see that and be like, hey, I can get a raise if this chick can do 25 minutes. Yeah.
Leah, that's really funny. And I do think, I mean, absolutely submit and women and people less represented in dry bars offerings submit. I mean, I'm sure they would be happy to receive more submissions. It's funny. I'm like, women
Mormonism
submit.
is
Yeah.
all about submission. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
submit women. Myq Kaplan goes on record today telling women they need to submit
That's hilarious.
and go to
Um,
Utah. Like, go to Utah and submit. Be one of
so
many women who submits to the will of one man. Okay, sorry, pulling a
that
joke.
is delightful. No, that is wonderful. But absolutely, like if you have a half hour of comedy that you are happy with and is clean, if you're happy with it now, send it to them. And if they're happy with it and they want to hire you to do a special, then film the best special that you can. Absolutely, that is the model that I did. I did not. I mean, I remember I started out around the same time as Ali Wong. I remember like doing, shows with the same, we were on the same shows in New York for a while. And I remember I forget when Baby Cobra came out, maybe 2015, 2016, whatever it was. By that time, we'd been doing comedy about the same amount of time, and I had put out like 3 hours of comedy and before she put out her first. And then she put out her first, and it really, exploded 100%. And there's absolutely like, did I do things wrong and she did things right? I don't think that's so. I think I did things my way and she did things her way. And whether, like, who knows what all of the calculations were? Like the thing that you're saying about, women not women being socialized to defer, men being socialized to ask for what they want and seek what they want and believe that they are worthwhile perhaps before they are, and women maybe my advice to me and to men is like, hey, maybe hold back a little bit, and my advice to women and non-men be like, go for it, go for it, like, because here's two things. One about my friend, a female friend who, the first time I was in Edinburgh, she was just in town for the Fringe for a few days, and she doesn't do stand up extensively, but has dabbled and like creates other things, but was considering, do I want to do stand up? Like, and then she's like, but since I don't know if stand up is my main thing, she's like, I don't know if I'd want to take away spots at an open mic from people who really know that it's what they want to do and love doing. And I was like, you are the voice that people should be hearing at an open mic. Like,
Yeah,
who are
exactly.
you taking away a spot from? A guy who wouldn't think that,
Yeah.
Um,
Some guy who wants to talk about Pornhub. It's like, no, please. And well, that's what I've noticed. Like Leanne Morgan, for example, she had a dry bar special and has now exploded, and she fills arenas with women. And to be honest, being a comedian in Philadelphia, which is a pretty rough city, and that's why I moved here. I wanted to move into what Jim Gaffigan calls the corridor of contempt. So, Philly, New York, Boston, all around here. I wanted something that would toughen me up. When I listened to some of Leanne Morgan's comedy and I place her in a bar show that I'm at, I was like, how would you get away with this? Like, you would never get booked on a show. But she's great and she's funny, but there's an audience there that's so hungry to hear someone tell their stories and relate to it. And this is something you and I talked about, of like writing for the rooms that you're in, that there are a lot of women who have children, but they're not really represented in comedy. There aren't people, and Ali Wong has great stories about that, about male comedians whose partners have babies, and then they get up on stage and complain about how hard it is and how their baby's a piece of shit while their wife is at home wearing a frozen diaper. And it's like, I'll be the frozen diaper wearing person that gets up there, and maybe my comedy is not Dave Attell, but it's just such a relief for women to hear, or anyone hearing someone echo their experience, which is another reason why I will put people on shows, even if they're not as funny, if they're giving voice to something that people haven't heard. And so in terms of like believing in yourself, part of it is believing that there are people that will want to hear what you have to say, even if it's not as polished and tight, because there's no other way to get polished and tight than by going up in front of people. It's kind of like, I heard this early on in comedy, that people you'd go to a show and there'd be like four male comedians, maybe one or two female comedians. And they'd be like, yeah, she's not as good as the guys. Oh, she's not as funny. And it's like, she's been doing it for 5 years. And the guy before her has been doing it for 20. And the guy after her has been doing it for 30 years. So it's not that she's not as funny. She's just newer. And so in giving people more opportunities to perform and to hone what they have, they can catch up more quickly. So to your friend's credit of like, oh, I want to give time to other people, it's like they'll find that time. Like you need to get better. You need the stage time to get better so that you're up more, so that you bridge the gap, or close the gap.
Yeah. Here's four things. Number one, I do think that you're Dave Attell. Number two, yeah. I
Are you
would
saying I have
say,
facial hair? Was that a menopause joke? Just kidding.
wow, okay, never mind. You're not Dave Attell. Dave Attell would lean into how he has facial hair.
That'll be my selling
The
point. Ladies.com.
To your point about shows with men and women on them, I think that people's assessments of them are also often flawed. Like if you go to the shows that you're talking about, where there might be women who have been doing comedy less long than some men on the shows, take the opposite of that. Take an open mic that has 20 dudes and one or two women, which I mean, more and more these days, I think like it is shifting. The demographics are becoming more representative of our country as a whole, but definitely historically, there's tons of open mics with majority dudes, and maybe one or two of them are great, and maybe and if the ratio and like 18 of them are probably not great, but if there's one woman on a show who's newer, then people are like, oh, women aren't fun. Like all of the women on the show weren't great because there was one woman on the show. Meanwhile, look at the majority of men on the show also weren't great, but people don't talk enough about all the guys that aren't great. They're like, behind every great man, they're like, but what about in front of every horrible man? Is a story we're not telling. Here's two other things. One is a thing that Stephen Wright said once, which your story about Leanne Morgan reminded me of. He said that, when I started out, I was performing in these, loud bars, and like people weren't even necessarily paying attention, and it was really difficult. And he's like, eventually I got, very lucky that now I perform in theaters full of people who are sitting down and listening, and they're the best audience. He's like, that's how it should be, the reverse. You should start out with a nice listening audience because you need it. And eventually you should work your way up to bars full of people who don't care and didn't know that there was going to be a show, because then you'll be prepared for it. But obviously, it makes sense why it doesn't happen that way. But that's the thing about Leanne Morgan is, of course, yeah, the thing that you could imagine her doing, like, of course she could do well in a bar show. She did well in bar shows long enough to get good enough that she doesn't have to do well at bar shows anymore if she doesn't want to.
Yeah.
Todd Barry, on his first album called Medium Energy, he opens it, I'm paraphrasing, imagine it better than this, but he basically says, I'm excited, I'm recording my first album, which is full of mostly jokes that I've been telling for years and I'm basically sick of, and a few ideas that are too new and I shouldn't be recording them right now, but I'm really excited about them.
Hmm.
And so I feel like that's another Niels Bohr, Great Truth, opposite situation where, and that can be like, that could be a microcosm of everything that we're talking about. Like, when is a show ready? When is a joke ready? Like, to get a joke ready, you have to present it when it's not ready. To get a show ready, you have to, you're going to be doing it for the first time. The first time you do anything, a joke or a show in full, it's not going to be as good, hopefully, as when you've done it for the 30th time or the 100th time. And you did raise a point that I want to address, like the question of, there's two issues at play with like with the questions that you're asking. One is like creatively, and one is financially. Like, if you were independently wealthy, you might make different decisions as to when to apply for certain things or ask for certain things or submit or be like, now it's ready. You could wait. You could afford the luxury, because you could afford luxury of waiting longer. But if you are, supporting a family, or, putting money away for your kids' college funds, or, paying the rent, like, yes, of course, it makes sense to want to have money to do that. And I do. Maybe I've recommended to you my friend Sarah Benincasa's book, Real Artists Have Day Jobs. And so it's a book of essays. She is a writer. She has also had, while being a comedian, a storyteller, a writer, day jobs. And there is like a mystique, like perhaps, I don't know if it's American specifically, but an individualistic, a capitalistic, like heroic journey that we like, the love story, the dream of like to be a comedian and nothing else, a full-time comedian. I am only a comedian. And there are people who have aspired to that, and in order to meet that goal, like lived in a box, like whether it's their car or a tiny apartment, or just metaphorically being like, if I don't buy all the things that I want or need, perhaps, I'll go without healthcare, I'll go without this, I'll go without that. And there's many like systemic things at play here. Like comedy is not exclusively a meritocracy. Some people start out life with a head start monetarily, a head start privilege wise, a head start the various, not just nepo babies or nepo babies, but like just there's people are starting from a lot of different it's not an even playing field. And yet we view success sometimes, we're like, but okay, did they make it by whatever my terms of making it means? Are they financially, like, are you and at this point, I mean, I wanted to be a full-time comedian. That was my goal initially, and I was fortunate to be able to achieve it thanks to both my work and my luck,
Yeah.
and now I'm like, oh yeah, if I ever wasn't making enough money from comedy to live, I'd be like, I'll work as a barista again. I'll look for other jobs. I'll become a teacher. I'll get another
The ability to
degree.
know that you can work hard and do things is one of the, I think, skills or attributes that give you the ability to persist in an artistic career. And I heard Anne Lamott say this, and Robert McKee, who wrote Story. He's a famous screenwriter, author, lecturer, etc. That he said when people like write a screenplay, for example, and it's their first one and they think it's amazing and they put everything into it, and then they start pitching it and trying to get offers and all this stuff for it. And he said, it's your first one, so it's not going to be good. So it's not going to be picked up. There's maybe a tiny chance. And then what happens is you put all this work in and you see that it's not working, and you're like, maybe, yeah, that was fun, but this isn't really realistic. And that's when the people who aren't real writers will move on to another thing. But real writers will just go, okay, next one. And they just keep going, and they'll keep whatever the day job is because they can't do anything else. Like, this is what I have to do. Anne Lamott said the same thing. She said, I have to write because I'm unemployable doing anything else. So I will walk dogs, clean houses, drive Uber, whatever I have to do so that I can still write. So this is the question that I have, and this is a recurring theme in my household. So I'm fine cleaning houses, watching kids, whatever I need to do to just have a steady income so that I'm free. And that was the advice that you gave me, is don't worry about making money at comedy for the first 10 years. And so I'm okay doing whatever. However, I can, partially just because I'm like a clean cut, middle-aged lady who won't swear or say anything controversial. I could get and push more corporate stuff and emceeing and hosting. So rather than doing shipped orders or babysitting or dog walking, I could be doing corporates. And might make at this point about the same amount of money if I push that. So that's stage time. However, that stage time takes me out of the scene, and especially the psyche of, I think, of creating unique dynamic work. Because corporates are, and I've heard comedians say that, like, cruise ship comedians aren't comedians, or that they're not. And I'm not here to argue that, but I'm curious if you had to pick between one or the other, of just working as a substitute teacher in the Philadelphia public school system, just as a hypothetical, and then doing comedy at night, or you had to pick really pushing corporate stuff and going anywhere and everywhere, doing corporate comedy as your bread and butter, at the expense of perhaps doing crummy gigs at maybe comedy clubs or festivals where you meet people like Myq that you won't meet if you're doing corporates. Because the main thing that I've observed, if you get too into corporates, you take yourself out of the scene. You're not interfacing that much with creative, like minded people because you're making enough money. It's kind of like you're in like a slumber. You're in your own little siloed community and you're making enough to be like, oh, I'm successful. But then years pass and you're like, how come my peers are surpassing me? And it's like, well, because they were still like risk taking and trying to make art and like getting out there and dying and then having to tweak things and get better and get booked on shows. Whereas I don't know, there's just kind of a humility that comes with doing a bunch of crummy, spots at comedy clubs during the week where there's 5 people in the audience that kind of sharpens you in a way of doing a corporate gig for $2,000 of people that aren't listening and it's a crummy gig, but you have your money and you go home, but you haven't like pushed anything, if that makes sense. So if you had to pick between the two, working a day job and being sure you had your nights free to do whatever kind of comedy, make whatever art you wanted, or to do corporates as a way of making money until you get big, which would you pick?
Great question. I mean, I'm going to first deny the dichotomy that you present by saying, like, if you could, I think that there is a way to do the corporate gigs and not succumb. That you could go, like, if you're traveling to do corporates, like, often they're during the day. Then while you're there, find a local open mic or comedy club or venue that you can also get on at night, that you don't have to worry about making money at, that you can continue to, make the art that you want to make.
Hmm.
If you can compartmentalize and be like, and even if that's so, like, I think there's many comedians, like, yes, the stereotype about corporates and cruise ships exists, though. Also, I'll not even push back, but just offer this. Our friend Sid Singh, who our Edinburgh buddy from 2023, who will be back this year as well, he's one of the funniest human beings that I have ever known. Like, every text, every, even in his prepared shows are beautiful, and just his off the cuff, like, his being, his very essence is so funny. And he told me that since Edinburgh last year, since a year ago, he has been booked on a lot of cruise ships. He has performed at a lot of cruise ships, and he told me that he mostly doesn't, he's a very political comedian in his shows,
Yeah, that's
but
how
on
I
cruise ships
illegally.
he does not do that.
Yeah.
And he just does crowd work, and he riffs, and he is off the cuff, and they love it, and it goes great. And so I think that is just an example of a way that, I think he's one of the most creative, talented, hilarious people I know, and he exceeds because of that at doing cruise ships. He transcends the idea that you have to be a hack to succeed on a cruise ship. Um, and so I imagine the same could be true for corporates. That said, we're not all Sid Singh. Maybe there's definitely stories of, even a Brian Regan not having a great time at a corporate, right?
Mhm.
Because of the environment, because of the circumstances, because it's 9 a.m., whatever it is. But I think that, like, when I've done things like that, I just view it as, so here's an analogy. I used to work at the Barnes and Noble Cafe in Kenmore Square in Boston. I just served coffee and stuff in the cafe, but for whatever reason, because we're part of the bookstore, once a week, if you were there on like a Thursday morning, the whole bookstore staff had, like, they called it a rally. It was just a meeting. We had a meeting with, like, it was required. Everyone had to be there. And the store manager would go through, like, here's how we're trying to sell more books today, or this week. And
Mhm.
we in the cafe were like, we are not trying to sell more books. We have to be here.
Punch in our clock.
And
Yeah.
it was, at the time, I don't conceive of many things as boring, but this was as boring an experience that I needed to be at because I was being paid to be there and I needed that money.
Hmm.
But the way that I entertained myself was, I imagined that I was in a Dilbert cartoon, basically. And I know the creator of Dilbert has gone many different directions in his political beliefs and expressions these days. And so at the time, I was like, oh, Dilbert, a funny cartoon about a boring office, right? And
Mhm.
so when the store manager would say things like, that seemed like corporate speak, I would just imagine like, what an amazing satire this man is creating. What a character.
Yeah, I would like pretend I was on like sketch comedy. I mean, there are times that way where I'm at like an open mic or something and it feels comical. I feel like I'm on a Key and Peele sketch show or something. I mean, just with like the comedian getting up with their hoodie and their ripped jeans being like, this guy gets it. I'm like, does he know that, like, I'm like, did somebody write this? It's
Yeah.
usually if I've done an edible, by the way. That's
And
what I'm like, where am I?
so that's my number one recommendation is if you take the corporate gigs, just make sure you're on an edible. And
No, because
but
I like to be able to finish my sentences. And
haha, yes.
I found that the barrier to success.
Yes, sincerely, I think that you seems like you know yourself, and I also would not do that. But I would get into that mindset as much as possible. If I were hired to do a corporate tomorrow, and I show up and it's as stereotypical as they sometimes seem like they could be, just like pretend that you're the character. Like, oh, I'm the character of corporate comedian. What would corporate comedian say?
I do that. I haven't done it for a while. I'm like, all right, Leah, today you're playing the role of calm woman. And I'm like,
That's
all right,
perfect.
ready and action. Like your kids spilled syrup on the carpet, the organic maple syrup. Like in Calm Woman enters this the living room. Okay, so I think if they're during the day, no problem. But I'll give you an example. I'm doing Adam Gable's show at West Side when I get back from Fringe, which to me I'm so excited about because I know Zarna Garg does that, and I would love to open for Zarna Garg. But I'm not going to open for Zarna Garg unless I meet her or unless she thinks I'm funny. And I would rather be at that, even though it's going to cost me money to get up to New York to, pay for the train, da 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 da, versus making $500 at a country club, being like, having kids is weird. Am I right? Like, but I do feel like stage time is stage time. And if you're a crummy comedian because you do corporates, that's on you because you're the you. So that you be better. That's not you, you have no one to blame but yourself if you're not writing better and if you're not pushing yourself. But I like Neil Brennan, 90% of the work that you get is going to be from other comedians. And so I like meeting other comedians like you, even at my own expense, like going to Fringe, because it means more to me to have a community of people that inspire me to be better. And that's sort of what I feel like is the primary cost of corporates. Not that you become hack, not that you don't gain your own audience, but you miss out on the camaraderie of other like dedicated creatives that are in spaces outside of the Marriott conference room number 2.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is again not like should I do all this or should I do all that? Like clearly you understand what you value. You value you value money when you need money, and you value things that are not money, because if you only valued money, then you would not have anything else joyful in your life. But if you only valued things that in our capitalistic society were not money, then you would not have. There's a joke that I tell sometimes about mo money, mo problems. And it's also the less popular no money, even mo problems, like no money, in fact, most problems. And like some money, probably fewest problems, but then mo money, mo problems again. But if you're closer to no, then you need some. And so this is a question of, is it too tight or is it too loose? At any moment, like if it's too loose, tighten. If it's too tight, loosen. And so I think it's great that you value, like, if there's specifically somebody's like, can you come here and make $500 on a day that you're like, but I was planning to have this, invaluable, creative, communal experience, then there's no wrong answer. There's no right answer. Like the answer could be like, hey, hopefully I'll have another chance for a communal experience if I need that $500 right now. Or if you don't need that $500 right now and you think it's worth investing the time, then absolutely do that. So, yeah, I mean, there's a limited amount of time in our lives. We don't actually know how much there is. For any day that we're alive, we know approximately how many hours there are. It's about 24. And how many are you awake and how many are you doing other things? I think this is funny. I feel like, so whenever I bring up Louis, I think about the Australian comedian Rhys Nicholson, who I met, I think in Melbourne in 2015, and then shared a green room with in Edinburgh in 2018, around the time that Louis was in the news for not comedy. And but Louis was still a topic that arose for many reasons, both, the reason he was in the news and because he was such an important figure in comedy for quite a while, including now. And Rhys brought up Louis at one point and said, Louis, God rest his soul, and then went on to say whatever he wanted to say, or whatever they wanted to say about Louis. And so I think about that. And the reason I bring up Louis now, God rest his soul, is
it's a scandal noted, but I like God rest his soul.
Yeah.
But do you want God to rest his soul, or should he be a little bit? Should he keep that unrest going?
Well, I want. I mean, I don't know that I believe in a soul, but in the confines of this, I do believe that everyone eventually deserves rest and peace. And I'll tell you this.
Sorry that I didn't mean to bring it. I actually don't have a bone to pick with, kind of the controversial stuff. I'm sort of
I'll tell you this.
Apolitical in a lot of arenas, and one is just comedy is really hard, and I respect comedians that have made good art, and I don't like the scandals around it, but I understand that everything's very complicated, and I just feel sad that people get hurt, and I don't want to take sides on anything because it's so complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not controversial to say that you can have enjoyed Louis' comedy, and you can also be saddened by the fact that he did what he did non-consensually, and that he may have been involved in silencing people, or that his management may have been involved in making it so that people in comedies, some women in comedy, were not able to succeed and thrive as they would have been otherwise. Those are two things that can both be true. And I'll tell you this. My friend Gus, a practicing Buddhist, told me once that he was alerted to the death of a politician, and he hadn't heard of the politician. So when they told him this person died, he said, "Oh, that's too bad." And then the person said, "No, actually, this politician was a racist, sexist."
Like, Stalin was pretty bad. You should know who he is. Just kidding.
And yes, joke noted and wonderful. And so they said, this person, it's not too bad that they're dead because they held these heinous views. And Gus said, oh, then I guess I would say it's too bad that they did not live long enough to see the error of their ways, regret their past actions, and atone and make meaningful amends for what they had done previously. That's what I think is too bad. And so it is in that spirit that I literally, as much as possible, I truthfully say God rest his soul. And the reason I bring him up is because my understanding is there was a time in his life when he was making a TV show almost on his own and writing comedy and touring and doing comedy. And he was co parenting children. And my understanding was that if he had the kids half the week, he just spent that half the week with the kids and he didn't do any of the other work. And then the half the week that he didn't have the kids, he worked and worked and worked and worked. And I think was, productive in that work. I think, at the time it was critically acclaimed, it was massively popular, and he was doing it only working half the week. And so that is an answer that I give to, like, should you pursue corporate comedy, or should you pursue, meaningful communion with other creatives that you enjoy? I think that's the first time I've ever used the word creative as a noun, and it'll be the last as well. Or should you spend time at home, meaningfully parenting your children and communing with your husband who you love? And the answer is, yeah, it is absolutely do all of those things that you can, that you want to, that speak to you in the moment. Like, plan. They say, hope for the best and plan for the worst, but also plan for the best. Plan for the best as well as plan for the things that aren't the best. Like, a piece of advice that you didn't ask for, but I give sometimes when people are preparing a 5-minute set for a late night audition or a festival submission or a showcase. One of the things I say is think about, like, if it has to be exactly 5 minutes or give or take 10 seconds or what have you, they're like, what if the jokes get more laughs than I planned for? I'm like, plan for them to get the most laughs. Don't plan for it to not, because if they don't get the most laughs, not that laughs are everything that matter, but definitely why not plan for it to go the best that it possibly could? And if it runs a little short, that's probably fine. If it runs over, that's usually more of a problem. But why not bet on yourself and be like, the best way that these jokes could go, I'm going to plan for them to go that way, because that'll be the thing that's most likely to lead to me getting the opportunity, right? Is if it goes the best possible. And so similarly, why not, if there's something that you can get out of corporate work, like pursue that some amount per day or week or month or whatever it might be. If you don't want to be on the road doing it all the time and you're given the opportunity, then only take half the gigs, only take a week a month or whatever it might be, and plan your family time and plan your comedy, communal creativity celebration fests, and plan them all, and then hope for it to go the best way possible. And then also, if it doesn't, be like, I feel like that's the way that I generally plan my comedy. Is I'll often go into a show with an idea of what I might say if it's not a recording. If I'm just like headlining a show on the road, I'm like, here's what I might start with, here's what I might end with, this is the show that I'm planning on doing. And if in the moment something different happens, one of my favorite ways for it to go is to have a beautiful plan and to fulfill something completely different. Yeah. So, which I think does go back to the beginning of the first topic that we started, is like, how do you know when something is ready and done? And I mean, the answer is you don't. But the more you do it, the more of an idea you will have. I'm just going to glance at our questions to see if we did. Let's see. Where's the line between a special should be special and done is better than perfect? I think that is a great truth opposite situation that we have addressed. And let's see. Do you run it by others before deciding to film it? I mean, for me personally, Renee, for this hour in particular, and for most of the comedy that I've ever made, since meeting her, she has been a partner in, you know, assessing and offering ideas and questions and suggestions. And then I do have a few other friends who I might, uh, send a version of the hour to. But for the most part, it's the audiences on the road and myself, and Renee. It's the inner and the outer, like another great truth
I think
opposite.
you're farther along than I am, and I guess maybe for like small dork and handsome. Um, was that pre Rainy? Pre
It was.
Yeah, and so I do think that it helps to have a partner that understands you and understands your comedy. But if you don't have your own ability to assess how good, or I don't like to say good, but if the material's ready or if it's true. Like for example, I needed your expertise for the sexual assault joke that I had, because as an outsider you're kind of like, huh, and I know I'm that way for other people, that I'll have a friend that's trying a joke and I'm like, the premise of that joke is X, Y. Is that what you want to say? Or that doesn't really fit your persona. I have a comedian friend that will swear in his sets, and it's like, it's not that I'm against swearing, but it always feels weird coming out of you, because it seems like you're putting something on. And so I guess to have a little cadre of people who understand your persona and your voice and can give you honest assessments. And right now, Renee is that for you. My husband can be that for me, but it's tricky with Mormonism and kind of the way we started. And so if I have, he's just like such a kind person that sometimes I second guess, where I'm like, I can say this about C-sections or something. And he's like, be nice, Leah. I'm just like, you're not a comic. And so, but if a Myq Kaplan goes, be nice, then I'm like, yeah, he's right. So
Yeah, I'll say this. I mean, I think number one, it is great to have people who are where you are, or who are, I'm happy to be a resource as much as possible. If you have things that you want to run by me, specific jokes or whole shows, like, you're my friend, and I'm happy to offer whatever I can that you request. And it is good to have, people that you're in the trenches with, you're the comedians whose voices resonate with you, people who know you and know what you're trying to do and know what you're aspiring to do. For sure. It is also very valuable to have, I feel like your husband is probably a wonderful asset. Like,
definitely.
An angel and a devil, a husband and a fellow comedian, a dirtbag,
Yeah, Jim and Jeannie Gaffigan. I mean, I love Jim Gaffigan. I don't think there would be a Jim Gaffigan without a Jeannie Gaffigan.
Yeah, there isn't.
I've heard them talk about their process and how they bounce ideas off of it, off of each other, and how she kind of helps him maintain the persona that he has. Because I know for me, I can fall into the trap of, but it works, but it's funny. It's like, but it's not you, and you're sacrificing the bigger picture of getting a cheap laugh that doesn't build toward what you're actually aiming for. And so at the end, it's almost like an unreliable narrator kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'll say this final analogy, maybe not final, but maybe we've talked about this, that there's some shows that, like, there used to be a weekly show in New York called Whiplash that was at UCB every Monday night, and it was one of my favorite places to do shows, in part because the audience was so great. They were full of comedy fans, savvy, comedy nerd types, and just like they were just there to laugh. They knew the show was going to be good. The show got great comedians, and so you could riff, you could experiment, you could do anything, and it was just beautiful. It was warmly received. And then on the flip side, there's a lot of shows that are the opposite of that. Shows where, no matter what you do your best stuff, and it doesn't get the response that you want. And I always felt like it was good to have both of those. It was good to have a place where almost everything succeeds, and if something doesn't work, then that's something to note. And then to have places where almost everything doesn't succeed the way you want it to, but if something does, then that's valuable to note as well. And so I feel like your husband is one of those for you. Your husband is like the very, the kind-hearted end of the
Normal
spectrum.
guy.
Haha. Yeah, I mean, that might represent the voice of, if not the only audience that you are seeking, at least a component of it. Like if the audience was made of all people who were like your husband, like would they, like, I think you'd want to be able to entertain them. Not only them, maybe you have a dirty show and a clean show. Maybe you have a more risque, like it seems like you are, to use a term briefly, you're edgier than your husband. And there may be jokes that you enjoy that he doesn't enjoy. And that's just a matter of taste. And, in 10 years, you could do a show where you talk about things that he questioned whether you should or could or would now, but maybe you'll be by that point, more capable and confident in who you are and what you're doing. And like there are full shows of about sexual assault, about topics that not that aren't for a dry bar audience. Like that there
Mhm.
is no one universal audience. Like there is you and your audience that you're both developing yourself and your audience, or your potential audience, your hypothetical future audience, and you're doing it, like one plank at a time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Thank you, Mike. I
yeah, of
yeah.
course. Any final questions or points that we didn't cover as much as you would have wished we did in this conversation?
No, I think it all makes sense, and sort of this idea that how you feel about today is how you feel about your life. And so, in terms of balancing uh, day jobs, corporate stuff, artsy stuff, spending time with family, spending time in nature, things like that, that there's not this elusive, well, one day when I hit this thing, then I'll have time. Or even, I think, bravely with comedy, well, these jokes work, so I'll do them. And it's like you might be that later. So, kind of like your thing with having a closer that works, and then not switching it out until you have one that works. Even that is like risk taking. I know Maria Bamford, she asks her openers to do new stuff. She's like, I want you to put it because, and I've tried to do that because sometimes I'll get booked on a bigger show and I'm like, okay, I've got to kill. I don't want to do this. It's like, if you're not willing to risk it at this level when you're filming a special, the lightning in a bottle thing, I think that's why we have so much respect for Rory, because he tries stuff that people will try at like small improv shows, but you're like, wait, you're filming this, it's a scarcity model, it's yeah.
Oh
So,
yes,
so
Rory is
with
an example of abundance for sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
so and that, I think that scarcity mentality uh bleeds into all the areas of life. So there are times where I can go out, and I usually hit every show that I can, but there are sometimes where, oh, I could go to this open mic, but they're only 3-minute sets and it's this part of town. They have a short list. And if I go there, that knocks off other people. I guess I'm like that lady. Um, but I'm like, no, I'm going to do family movie night and just snuggle tonight, because if I'm on late night one day, if I'm going to need to also go, well, I could go out and do this thing with the other, but I also want this to be a part of my life, because so many people climb up to the top and they get there and no one else is there because they didn't kind of take the time to bring them up with them and continue to make them a priority. So even if it seems like a waste of my time, like I talked to you about this comedy showcase that I run, and I hate the admin for it. I'm like, oh, should I? It's like draining my creative energy. Should I just get rid of it? It's like, if it's not running that, eventually it will be writing a pilot for this show that, like, there's always going to be something boring admin that you don't want to do. How are you going to tackle that? So how are you going to find balance in your life and learn when to say yes and to say no to things? And I think basically that's the heart of my questions about specials, is how do you know when to say yes and when to say no, and what to include and what to wait until it's more polished. And it just comes with like trusting yourself and trusting a community that you've built up around you to, help nudge you in the ways you want to go.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. you'll know. Like, and if you don't know, then you don't know yet. And my friend Zach Sherwin and I talk about when we're, whether in creative or personal challenge mode, like when there's a question of what is going to happen, what am I going to decide? It's either going to be this or that, you know, now or later, wait, like yes or no. And if you don't have to decide right now, you don't have to decide right now. And we view it as a time climb, like that we're climbing the mountain of time, you know. And you know the trope of like that you see in a lot of New Yorker cartoons where there's a guru like in a cave atop the mountain, and you go up and you ask that guru the answers to the meaning of life. And in this limited example of it, you get to the top of this time climb, and the guru is you in the future. You in the future will know the answers to the questions that you in the present now have. You just haven't done the time climb yet. The not just time, but the putting in the, not like we talk about putting in the time, but that means putting in the work, the effort,
And too.
using resources that you have to get there. Or sometimes it is just time. And then if enough time passes and you're like, well, I guess I'm not going to have any more information. So I can only make the decision to the best of my ability right now, with all of, you know, with my friends having weighed in, with my having considered it. And then you only get to do it once. You only get to do one thing once. And then if later you're like, oh, I wish I would have waited longer, then next time wait longer. And then
I'm so good at it that it doesn't take you as long, and then you actually get there faster.
oh yeah, the next, oh, I should have done it shorter. The next time wait shorter, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, just I always like to think about this, the quote from Thoreau when he was asked about life after death, and he said, "One world at a time." So one, you know, one world at a time, one day at a time, one joke at a time, one show at a time, one moment at a time, one podcast at a time. So thank you so much, Leah, for coming
Thank
on
you. This has been
again.
helpful, and best wishes with your upcoming special.
Thank you so much. And anyone who is in Edinburgh for the month of August 2024, what is your show there called?
It is called 10-Pound Baby. And it's,
Amazing. Well, seek
yeah,
out Leah and her work on Dry Bar in the future, and in Edinburgh this year, and in Philly for most of the year, and all the times and places where you can find her. And yes, if you're in New York City on August 22nd, 2024, please come to my taping of Before We Get Started. And now, before we get finished, we did it. Thank you so much, Leah.
thank you, Myq. Cheers.